Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. I'm very pleased to say hello once again to you in another episode of Ars Boni. In this episode, I have the privilege to talk to Lara Bird and Josh Fleming, both of them from the Office for Students in the United Kingdom. Lara is a strategic policy advisor in this office, and Josh is the head of strategy oversight and implementation at the Office for Students. The main reason why I invited them is that I found a very interesting publication on the internet that is freely accessible for everyone, and I will put the link to this publication in the show notes. A freely available publication with the title Gravity Assist, Propelling Higher Education Towards a Brighter Future. And obviously, this is about 150 or 160 pages about the impact that COVID-19 had and still might have on higher education in the UK. But obviously, many of the thoughts and many of the outcomes might also be transferred into other areas and other regions of this continent. And it's a privilege to have you here, Lara, Josh. Thank you for coming. Perhaps let's start with a very stupid question, but still I think that some of our listeners might not be completely familiar with the Office for Students. So could you briefly, kindly explain what this is and what you are doing there?
Yeah, happily. So the Office for Students is the regulator for higher education in England, so slightly narrower than the UK. And we use a mixture of regulatory tools, whether it's funding, sanctions, information, advice, to try and improve the higher education system, and particularly focus on students, so improving outcomes for students, whether that's improving access to higher education, improving the experience and the quality of higher education while they're there, or indeed what happens after higher education. So going on to getting good jobs or living fulfilling lives, and so on and so forth. So we're student focused. We're the regulator of higher education in England, and we are independent, but obviously part of the wider government system.
I see. And I mean, from a continental perspective, I think one of the many questions that I would have as a university professor would be, in how far does your office intervene with the freedom of research and the freedom of teaching of research? So is this a typical conflict that you face, that people start arguing that whatever you are doing might be in conflict with the freedom of the professors involved?
Yeah, you're not the first person to raise this question, I think. The institutional autonomy is a really important part of most or many higher education systems around the world, and definitely the English one. And it's in the act, the law that created us. One of our general duties is to have regard to the need for the importance of institutional autonomy. So we treat it, sacrosanct is perhaps an exaggeration, but it's really important, and we're definitely not trying to impinge on institutional autonomy where we can. That said, institutional autonomy can, at least hypothetically, conflict with the student interest and other things that we as a society ultimately might seek to achieve. So whilst we're definitely careful, and wherever we can, we don't want to hinder autonomy, there might be cases where, for the protection of students, we intervene and in some cases, undermine ultimately institutional autonomy. But it's carefully curtailed, and there are some really strict provisions around the autonomy that a professor might be worried about the subject content of their course, for example, and we absolutely do not get involved in anything like that.
Yeah, but intervention might also mean something which is coming with hard law. So a strict rule. It's not just advising people or showing best practices. It can be harder than this, correct?
Yeah. And there's a whole toolkit of tools that we can deploy, and they range from pretty soft things that, as you describe, advice, stuff like that, but it also includes monetary penalties. So we can fine institutions. We can impose specific conditions, which I guess are kind of like rules, onto the way the institution is operating. And at the really extreme end, we can deregister an institution, which in simple terms means cutting off their access to taxpayer-backed student finance, which for a lot of our universities is a really important part of their funding stream. So at the very extreme end, there's some pretty drastic things that we can do. I think in all cases, and all of the kind of harder, the sanctions, the harder end of our interventions, we don't want to use them. Many regulators talk in these terms around the world. We have these sanctions, we have this pretty extensive toolkit, but in an ideal world, we would never have to use these against an institution, on an institution. We want to see a flourishing, productive, innovative sector, and indeed, in a lot of cases, we have that already. We're not going to be, slapping fines on an institution just because we feel like it. We want the same thing that a lot of institutions want, and so our approach to regulation, if you like, is one that's designed to avoid having to use those sanctions wherever possible. But if students' interests are contravened in particular ways, then ultimately we will act.
I see. And you are doing this as an independent institution. So it's like an independent data protection authority or telecom authority or similar regulators. So there is independence probably in your genes, right? Is that correct?
Yes, and indeed in statute. So we obviously have a relationship. So when we're accountable to Parliament, and we have a good working relationship with central government and the Department for Education. But ultimately, we have to make the decisions ourselves, and we take our independence very seriously. We think that's an important part of making sure that we're doing right by students, doing right by universities and colleges, and indeed doing right by society. It's pretty foundational to how we function.
I see. And what happened then to your institution in March 2020 when this whole COVID-19 pandemic started? Were you completely overwhelmed by requests from students and universities, or was it chaotic, or how would you describe the start of all this?
Yeah, it was, it feels like a lifetime ago, to be honest. I think for us as an institution, we had the whole quickly working online, getting our own systems up to date. So we went through a lot of the same stuff that universities were going through, and I think pretty much everyone, at least everyone in a kind of a knowledge-based job, went through. Then in terms of the sector, there was, it was amazing how quickly people responded, actually, and really, really impressive. So when we were speaking to people for this report, which we'll come on to in a bit more detail, we often heard phrases like, "We've done in 5 weeks what we thought would take 5 years to deliver." So the pace of change was unbelievably quick, and it was immediate. People reacted really, really quickly. So it wasn't, and there were definitely issues with the transition. I don't think anyone's pretending otherwise, but we were surprised by, or I was surprised, I can't speak for anyone else, by the really impressive pace of change. And although the learning wasn't perfect, institutions were able to make sure that there was some continuity, that students were being served, at least to a degree, quite rapidly, in those crucial 3, 4, 5 weeks around March, at least in the UK.
And I assume that the publication we are talking about, this Gravity Assist Propelling Higher Education Towards a Brighter Future, is one of the outcomes of this early phase then, and the lessons you learned in this early phase, right, as a regulator also.
Yeah, so the genesis of the report is in summer, the Secretary of State for Education, Gavin Williamson, asked our now former chair, the inaugural chair, the Office for Students, Sir Michael Barber, to essentially capture the lessons learned and make sure that, I spoke about that incredibly quick transition. It was really difficult and required a huge amount of effort and goodwill from staff, students, everyone involved. And I'm sure no one would want to relive it in quite the same way, quite aside from the pandemic, just on the work side. But really positive things happened there, or at least that's what we thought. And so Gavin Williamson asked Sir Michael Barber to conduct a review to dig into what happened, to what went on, and to see if there was anything that we could distill from that experience that would have, I suppose, implications for the coming year, but also wider ramifications for the sector over time. Were there things that we'd learned during the pandemic that actually will be relevant, not just while we're still learning to live with coronavirus, but also, 5-10 years in the future, and will change the direction of the sector, hopefully for the better, indefinitely.
I see. And could you kindly therefore report briefly what the main recommendations of the report are and who in particular should follow them?
Sure. Well, Lara, why don't you talk us through the main points, and then I can talk a bit about who we're aiming it at.
Yeah, sure. Very happy to do that. So we, in thinking about the recommendations, put together a kind of model that grouped together everything that you would need to deliver effective digital teaching and learning. And so we came up with 6 categories of things, but they're also kind of recommendations in themselves. So this is kind of hard to explain on a podcast without a visual aid, but if you can imagine having a circle in the middle, so you've got an inner core with 4 things in it. And the first of those is that you need to redesign pedagogy in your curriculum. So this really came from seeing a lot of universities that understandably had needed to move their in-person teaching to digital delivery quite quickly. But in the longer term, what we found was that what really constitutes high quality digital teaching and learning is the kind of learning that has been designed specifically for the digital environment. So that's the idea behind that recommendation. And then once that's in place, moving to thinking about whether all students have digital access. So that doesn't just mean in terms of do they have a laptop, although that is part of it, but it's also do they have the right software? Do they have a reliable internet connection? Do they have space to study? Do they have a trained teacher who can help them use the technology? And is the infrastructure, the technology that they're using robust? So if it's crashing every 5 minutes, that's clearly not going to be a high quality experience. So we thought about digital access in those 6 categories. And then once that's in place, move to kind of thinking about digital skills. So this is both students and staff we're thinking about here. And I think what we really wanted to emphasize was the importance of this being an ongoing and continual process. So maybe in the past, it might have been something that people were doing once a year on a course, or just kind of a tick box exercise. But what we found to be really important is this continual improvement, continual learning. And we had some great examples in the report of people who were, during the pandemic, getting people who were kind of the star digital teachers and sharing what they were doing with the rest of the university to the other staff, and that turned out to be really effective. And similarly for students, most students have pretty good digital skills in terms of the basics, but that doesn't necessarily translate into using some of the more specialist software that might be needed for certain subjects. So then on that 4th category, we talked about harnessing technology effectively. So this is really about making sure that the technology that is being used is aligned with the kind of learning outcomes you want to deliver. And part of that is about involving students and staff in the decisions you make about technology. So if you're going to go to a big external company to procure some technology, have you actually thought through what the learning outcomes you want to achieve are, and have you asked for feedback from students and staff on whether they think this technology will work for them? So this kind of is all fairly basic and sounds quite straightforward, but in the context of a pandemic was quite challenging. And because so many universities were completely new to this, getting these fundamentals pinned down, I think, was really important as a solid foundation. So moving out from that circle now, try and use hands to illustrate, but on the outer rings, we've got embedding inclusion. for students. So this is really about designing learning in a way that's accessible and inclusive. So for students that have particular accessibility needs, like visual impairments, for example, making sure that the learning works for them, and also that they're involved in the design of the learning so that they can give feedback. And then finally, we've got planning strategically. So this is about considering the long-term implications of what you're doing. Also, again, to come back to that theme of involving students and staff, that's really important in the strategic planning, understanding what they want, what they are looking for going forward. And then also, I think an important part of this is considering investment in the future and the balance of investment between the physical campus and then what we term the digital campus. So previously, people or universities were very heavily weighted towards the physical campus, but going forward, that obviously needs to be reconsidered as people work out exactly how much digital teaching and learning they want to be doing in the next, say, 5 or 10 years. So that's a very rapid run through of the whole 150-page report, but we can dive into more detail, I'm sure, as we go through.
Thank you very much, Lara. Yeah, the question that still remains is who is the addressee of this? So who should follow these recommendations? That would be my first question. And the second one is, one of the things that I found specifically interesting when reading it is that there is relatively little on exams and examinations and how these should be organized. Whereas this is a very, very urgent problem, at least at my university. And it has become an even more urgent problem during the pandemic, because more and more of the professors are seriously concerned about in how far cheating and other forms of academic misconduct might happen more frequently online than offline. And on the other side, students who are very irritated about the changes that they need to adapt with every new cycle of exams, because the university comes up with new ideas. And so perhaps I would really appreciate if you could also say a little bit more about how exams play a role in your thoughts and in the report.
Sure. So let's take the audience question first. And I think, I mean, there are multiple audiences for this. So certainly the recommendations that Lara alluded to, they are pitched at varying levels of the institution. So clearly, particularly if we go back to Lara's image of the concentric circles, that inner core, that's most relevant to people designing, developing courses, professors, the teaching staff, departments. But then if you just view it through that narrow prism of individual departments, I mean, you'll know better than me. You can, in institutions, you can get a lot of fragmentation and different departments that like to do things differently. But actually, particularly when you're talking about things that are quite tech intensive, it's important to think about scale and to think about this at a strategic level. Similarly, with the equality and diversity angles here, if you're not thinking about those on a systemic level, you run the risk of creating gaps and creating, I guess, an educational experience which is not conducive to getting the best out of every type of student that you have in your institution. So as well as those, on the front line of teaching, there's a lot of really important content here for the leadership of institutions. And I think where we've seen digital teaching and learning done really well is where you have a vice chancellor, head of an institution, or someone in their top team who is really championing and driving this as a strategic agenda. It's not just something done on the side. And clearly it was strategic for everyone during the pandemic, but I think thinking ahead to what this looks like in a more sustainable system, you need to have that representation. So there's clearly a strong focus on institutions as recipients of the recommendations. But then I think there are other groups beyond that this report has, hopefully anyway, has some important messages for. So another group that I highlight is technologists. You have the institutions, but you also need people designing the technology. to underpin the weird and wonderful pedagogies that can be created in a digital space. And I think them reflecting on this model, this process, these different aspects that you need to consider, I would hope will really help improve the dialogue. It gives a common language, if nothing else, between the technologists on the one side who are making the products, the tools that underpin the digital teaching learning, and the teachers and the institution that are implementing it. So you've got the institutions, you've got technologists, you've also got policymakers, and that includes regulators like us, but it also extends to those in central government thinking about the long run vision for the higher education system of a country or a region, thinking about not just the kind of potentially quite faddish or buzzwordy notion of digital teaching and learning. It's everyone's talking about things being online because it's the topic of the day at the moment, but actually going into the detail of, well, what does this look like? What does this mean? Breaking it down into this framework, we hope, and certainly for us, we find it helpful, unpicks the different aspects of what good digital teaching looks like, and in particular will enable policymakers to start thinking about how their tools, how their interventions shape the incentives around these different aspects. So are there unintended consequences of the way that they're designing funding competitions, or is the nature of their regulation encouraging or hindering one of these 6 aspects of effective digital teaching and learning, for example? So I think those are probably the main groups. We also, although admittingly it's not as directly relevant, I think there is at least some of the report which matters for students as well. So this is not regulatory guidance. This is, these aren't part of we're not going to use any of the tools that I spoke about earlier on if an institution isn't doing any of these things. But certainly, if you look at student unions and students calling for changes to the way that their education is delivered and the way that they work with their academic staff, this again gives them a tool, a framework, maybe even inspiration for what could be done and the kinds of things that they can ask for and push for, and in many cases co-create with their institutions to improve their educational experience and improve the culture, the ethos, the potential of the institution that they find themselves in.
I see.
So hopefully, lots of people, to cut a long answer short. And then you asked about assessment, which I think Lara might want to come in on. I guess the overarching, or two points that I would make here. Firstly, I think an important message here is that the potential of digital in terms of assessment means that you can be as rigorous, if not even more rigorous, using these tools. Because I know that's one of the concerns that particularly academics have, is that concerns around cheating, or does it have the same rigor? Is it as valid and reliable as the traditional approach to assessments that we've used? And I think our conclusion from what we heard and saw talking to all these people and reviewing the literature is that it absolutely can be, and in fact assessment can be much enhanced with the right tools. So that would be, I guess, the main message to take from it. The second point about the focus, I think definitely during the pandemic, assessment was an area that people struggled with, and just the timing of the report meant that we had only gone through, or a lot of institutions have only gone through one round of assessment, and it was pretty close, at least in England, to that first wave of the pandemic. So a lot of the lessons were, I guess, there was a lot of noise around the conclusions people were drawing that meant that it was harder for us to distill really concrete conclusions and examples that we could share. But having said that, we definitely, and particularly from the literature, found that there was this opportunity for rigor, for for huge improvement, I think. But Lara might want to say more on this.
Yeah, I think I'd just add to Josh's point about the potential of digital assessment. I'd say we were very keen to emphasize the opportunities for disabled students for digital assessment. So again, there's not masses of evidence because it's only been 1 year, but I think anecdotally at least we heard a lot of people saying, you know, usually we get this many complaints or this many issues around disabled students and their exams, but this year we've had none because the default has just been for everyone to do it online, and actually for disabled students that the experience has been a lot more positive. So yeah, I think there are huge opportunities here, and I think once there's a bit more stability and people work out exactly how to do it well, I think it could be a really positive change. And just from some of the polling that we did for the report, we found that just over 60% of undergraduate students said they wanted all or at least some of their assessments online going forward. So I think even despite this quite challenging year, challenging for lots of reasons, it's still quite still a lot of positives to be taken from it, and I think that will only increase going forward. And from a marking perspective as well, I think we heard a lot about the advantages of moving away from paper assessments.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. Which brings me to the question: in how far the report is going to be updated, or are you planning a second edition, and what is the overall feeling in England when it comes to assessment and organization at universities? Do you still see this as as 1 year that was completely different from everything else? Or is it getting more and more part of the same, so that a lot of what you wrote might become reality even after the pandemic is completely over?
Yeah, so on the first question about whether we're doing a second edition, I don't think we'll do a second report in this form, but we're continuing to have conversations with people who are using the report and talk about it, and we've been trying to do as much international engagement as well, so it's kind of expanding the reach of this report beyond England and the UK, I guess, by doing this podcast as part of that.
Indeed, I appreciate this.
So that's, I mean, yeah, it's good for us in that we're expanding the reach of it. But yeah, just on the question about what the feeling is now, I think there's obviously a huge amount of variety in how much digital teaching and learning different universities will be doing. So for some, they're already doing quite a bit, or all of their learning was online. So I think it really depends on where they want to go on that spectrum. And in doing this report, we were trying to come up with a model that would work regardless of where you want to be on the spectrum. So it could be that you still want to maintain 90% of your teaching in person, but the 10% that you do online using this framework will still ensure that it's really high quality. So I think it does vary, but just from the feeling we've got, it does seem that a lot of these lessons that have been learned over the past year will continue. And I think things like assessment and lectures as well, I think there are going to be huge changes, and many people said they can't really see themselves going back to 300-person lectures, things like that. So yeah, I think a lot of change will come.
Yeah, so Josh, please.
Sorry, I was just going to link it back to one of your earlier questions about institutional autonomy, and possibly head off any kind of misinterpretation around what we're advocating for in this report. So we're definitely not saying that all higher education should now be delivered online, and that's the best way to do it, and there's no place for in-person delivery. We're not saying that at all. We're saying that digital teaching and learning, when done well, and we articulate how we think you do that in the report, can be as good, if not better in some instances, than in person. And looking at how much was done before the pandemic, we think more should be done of it. But we're not being prescriptive, and we're not saying everyone should be online. There's definitely a place for mostly or even totally in-person delivery in the kind of ideal higher education sector.
Yeah,
bring it back.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, and then to bring it back to the domestic context and your point about institutional autonomy. Ultimately, this is a decision for academics, for leadership teams in universities to decide where they want to be, and they'll be guided by lots of different factors, like the sustainability of their institution, their balance between research and teaching, the particular pedagogies that they specialize in and want to develop. So it's up to them to decide. What we're advocating is if you do it well, and here are some ways to do it, and then B, as a whole, both in England and indeed around the world, we think the potential of digital teaching and learning is somewhat untapped, and there's a lot more that we could do, and we expect to see a lot more of it in the future.
Yeah, I mean, one of the very, I must say, anecdotal impressions that I have is that many of the English universities that are well known have identified a completely new market now, which is remote teaching without the need to move to the UK, and they are actively promoting these new courses and opportunities now. At least in my Facebook timeline, I see those twice or three times a day, right? And do you have any impressions on the market development here? And could you do you share this, that this also comes with a lot of opportunities, in particular for those universities that are well known, and that might then also produce a kind of a problem for those who are not that well known on an international market, at least?
Sure. So I don't have any particular intel beyond occasionally getting an advert as you do on my various social feeds. But I think, at least in the abstract, I can see how this would be a big opportunity, and I think for England and the UK, it has a very strong higher education sector, and I think it's a great thing if more people around the world are able to access that when barriers of physical location or finances or whatever it may be might have constrained them previously. I think, again, kind of the report is about how do you make it effective, and you need to do it right. You can't do you wouldn't want this to become just a money-making opportunity, and I'm sure of the institutions that are doing it are not, this is not just a get rich quick scheme, because both from a kind of educational standpoint, that's not great, but also from a business model sustainability standpoint, if you see a huge wave of courses being launched online, but actually none of them are very good, the demand will react to that, and people won't want to go on these courses. So yeah, there's definitely potential there. And then I think the final part of your question was around I guess the competitive dynamics here relating to reputation, and certainly, and I guess I've kind of implicitly covered that. I think reputation will clearly play a role, and institutions need to play to their strengths and their focus, and they often do. I think given that the potential growth in this space, and actually it's still relatively untested. I mean, there are some pretty big numbers and some pretty big institutions in the UK, and indeed other parts of the world do this kind of transnational education, but the potential size of the market is probably far bigger. I wonder, anyway, I don't know if this will be borne out, if there's possibly almost a reputational, it's not quite a reputational reset, but you need to prove your reputation again. So you can't rest on your laurels, having built up a well-deserved reputation for kind of traditional or in-person delivery models. If you're expanding and doing it badly, people will notice that you're doing it badly, and then your reputation in the international space will decline, or at least in the online space. So I suppose, yes, you might see those reputational effects playing a role, but also there's a huge opportunity, I think, for institutions to craft a new reputation in the space, There's a lot of people out there who could benefit from really high quality higher education, and if you can do it well, now is the perfect time to be expanding and helping those students on their higher education journey.
Yeah, I see. So many of our listeners, as you certainly know, are students of law, which brings me to more or less my last important question, at least in my view, which is there anything specific in law studies that might be a reason why law needs to be taught differently than all the other subjects? Because as you might know, at least for continental university professors in law, that's a very standard argument, to say this is completely different from everything else. We don't need all these new technologies and methods and lessons learned because we are different. Do you see anything which is specifically different in law, or would you argue that the report and the outcomes of the report also apply for everything that is related with law studies?
So I think, it clearly does vary by subject, and I wouldn't want to say that all of this can be applied to every part of every subject. Clearly, there are some things that need to be done in person, medicine and dentistry. I think some of the examples we used in the report. Yeah. But at the same time, I think we were surprised by the amount that could be done online in this over the past year. And I think that probably applies to law as well. And so kind of related to that, one of the points that we were making in this piece of work was to say digital teaching and learning can itself help to develop the digital skills that students will then need to work in professions, and those professions will change based on technological development, but also in the past year, I'm sure the legal profession, I know the legal profession has changed a lot. People have moved slightly further away from the very heavy paper focus that it's previously had, and people have been very surprised by what can be done online. So I think there's a role for universities to play in preparing students for the labour market of the future, and in law, that means preparing students for what the legal profession will look like when they graduate. And just to give a kind of specific example, this wasn't included in the report, but we did hear after publishing it about an example of a professor at Brunel University in London who had been running online dispute resolution simulation workshops. I don't know if that's something that you've been doing or have come across, but she was telling us that it had been very successful and that they were planning to do it going forwards, and that it was helping to prepare students for working as lawyers in a more digitally enabled workplace. So I think there is, even in law, still a lot of this report that applies.
Yeah, which brings me to my last question, if I may do so, which is about your, I think it was the second or the third pillar of these 6 that you had, which is building digital skills. I think this is, it's easy to say this, but it's rather difficult to do this in the typical university infrastructure, in particular because many of the professors, at least generally speaking, are lacking digital skills in comparison with their students. So how in particular could you or could your institution or could your report or could we as an academic community help teachers in building their own digital skills that they might need on this journey in the future?
Yeah, so I completely agree. I think that's been one of the major challenges of the past years, staff digital skills. The vast majority had never taught online before, so it's completely understandable that this was a big challenge. And when we were looking at some of the polling from the report, what we found was that students were more likely than staff to feel very confident in their ability to engage with online learning. So that was interesting. In terms of practical tips or things we learned from case studies, I think some of the most effective examples were fairly simple. So things like creating a shared forum for people to discuss what they were doing or to share examples of things that had worked well. And Keele University in the UK gave us a great example of the STAR teachers sessions that they were running. So they had teachers who were really passionate about delivering digital learning, had been doing it well before the pandemic, and they just ran workshops with staff to talk them through what they did. So I think there are a lot of quite creative things you can do in addition to building in more regular training as part of a longer term process.
Mm-hmm. Just to jump in there very quickly, this comes back to the point about needing leadership to really support and drive this work. So I think it's very hard and kind of unrealistic and unreasonable to expect an individual professor or group of teachers to acquire all these skills themselves. You need the institution to have a focus on this. The institution needs to identify what the skills gaps are among their teaching staff, and then support them, enable them, train them in the skills that they're going to be using. And I think it will vary from institution to institution, from department to department. You need to find out, and I think it's I guess it's easy to rely on stereotypes about how technologically advanced one group is and one group isn't. But and this applies to students as well. You can't assume that a typically young cohort is going to be going to have the right technological skills for the particular software or tools or whatever it is that you're using. Similarly, you can't necessarily assume that the staff aren't going to be adept with those programs and that software. So, finding out, understanding the local context is a really important first step, and then from the relevant, from the top or the relevant authority, really driving home and leading and empowering both sides of that equation, of that student-teacher relationship, to acquire those skills that they need in time, so they can properly benefit from the content and the substance that they put on.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Lara. Thank you so much, Josh. I really appreciate this hour that I spent with you, and I really like the report. You should read it. Those of you who are listening to this, it's really a lot of food for thought. Thank you for your time. Kindly stay connected with us, stay interested, and in particular, stay as healthy as you can. Have a good afternoon. All the best. Thank you.